Sometimes the hardest inheritance isn't what someone leaves you, but what they never gave you when they were alive. For Apache tracker Balen, that inheritance was a broken-down ranch from a white grandfather who never once spoke his name. The old place sat rotting in Montana's northern pines, nothing but sagging timber and a lone, wild brown horse that wouldn't leave. Balen figured he'd patch what he could and live quiet. But that horse kept digging at something by the fence line. What it uncovered changed everything. Buried papers proving the land held mineral rights worth over $3 million. Now men with rifles are watching from the tree line, and Balen must decide if he'll fight for land that was stolen from his people or walk away from the biggest fortune he'll ever see. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Balen Crowfeather had learned to read the forest the way other men read newspapers. Every bent twig told a story. Every scent carried meaning that most folks would never understand. At 38, he moved through the Montana wilderness like smoke, appearing and disappearing as needed. The reservation had been his world for nearly 4 decades, a place where old ways still mattered, where a man could find purpose, tracking what others couldn't see. He'd made his living guiding hunters looking for elk and deer, though most couldn't track a bleeding buffalo through fresh snow. But 3 days ago, everything changed with a weathered envelope bearing his name. The inheritance letter found him at his small cabin on the Blackfeet Reservation, delivered by a nervous lawyer from Kalispell who kept checking his watch. The paper felt thin in Balen's weathered hands. The kind of document that had seen too many years in filing cabinets. Your grandfather. Thomas Murdoch left you property, the lawyer explained, his voice carrying the discomfort white folks felt discussing family matters with Indians. The 240 acres in the Kootenai National Forest, been vacant since he passed 5 years ago. Balen stared with the stillness that made people uncomfortable. He'd heard Thomas Murdoch's name whispered around reservation fires, usually followed by spitting. The white man who'd connected himself to the Crowfeather bloodline. The outsider who'd taken what wasn't his. Why now? Balen asked. The lawyer shuffled papers. Took this long to track you down. Your grandfather was thorough. Said the land should go to the one who could read the signs. Now Balen stood at his inheritance, feeling like he'd stepped into someone else's nightmare. The ranch sat in a bowl of pine trees, 30 miles from the nearest neighbor, accessible only by a dirt road that had seen better decades. The main cabin sagged under too many winters, its cedar-shake roof green with moss and pierced by daylight. Outbuildings leaned at impossible angles, but it was the horse that stopped him. The animal stood in what had once been a corral, watching his approach with intelligent brown eyes that seemed to hold secrets. A sturdy mare, chocolate brown with a white blaze, built for mountain work. She looked well-fed, despite the property's abandonment. Balen approached slowly, making the soft sounds his grandmother had taught him. The mare stepped forward and pressed her muzzle against his palm, breathing his scent like she was memorizing it. Where did you come from, girl? The horse nickered softly and turned toward the cabin, inviting him to follow. Inside, the cabin told the story of a man who'd lived alone with his thoughts too long. Books lined makeshift shelves, volumes on mining, geology, local history, mixed with attempts to learn Apache and Blackfeet languages. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth cold but clean. In the bedroom, Balen found his grandfather's belongings neatly arranged despite years of neglect. On the nightstand sat a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed but intact. Balen opened it carefully. Thomas Murdoch's handwriting was precise, educated. The entries were sparse but revealing. April 15th, 1987. The dreams came again, Sarah's voice calling from across the years. I keep thinking about what I took from her people, from our boy. How do you make amends for wrong choices? June 3rd, 1989, found the mare wandering the old mining trail. She's got Apache markings, the kind Sarah used to point out. Maybe she found her way here for a reason. October 12th, 1991. Lawyer says I can't just give the land back. Too many legal tangles from the original claim. But there's got to be a way to make things right. Balen closed the journal, throat tight. Sarah, his grandmother, dead before he could remember her face. The grandmother, whose stories carried both love and sorrow. Outside, the mare had wandered to the collapsed fence line, pawing at ground that sounded different under her hooves. When Balen approached, she stepped back and watched with intelligent eyes, as if she'd been waiting for him to notice. The earth here was disturbed, different from surrounding soil. Someone had dug here once, then covered their tracks, but time revealed secrets. Balen knelt and brushed away surface dirt with his hands. His fingers found metal. That night, Balen made camp in the main room, building a fire and listening to wind move through pines. The mare sheltered in the barn, content to share space with this stranger, who carried familiar scents. As flames danced, Balen thought about inheritance, not just land and buildings, but the complicated legacy of choices made in desperation. Thomas Murdoch had been connected to his family somehow, connected enough to leave everything to a grandson he'd never met. But reservation stories painted him as a man who'd taken more than he'd given. Tomorrow, he'd dig deeper. Tonight, he'd sit with questions and let the fire burn down to coals. The mare whinnied softly from the barn, a sound that felt like welcome. Outside the firelight, Montana wilderness held its secrets close. But Balen had spent his life reading signs others missed. Whatever his grandfather had buried by that fence, whatever had kept a loyal horse waiting, he'd find the truth, even if it changed everything about his family. The inheritance letter rustled in his jacket as he shifted closer to fire. And for the first time in years, Balen Crowfeather felt exactly where he belonged. The mare's behavior grew stranger with each passing day. Balen had spent 2 weeks settling into the cabin, patching the worst holes in the roof and clearing decades of debris from the main room. The horse, he'd taken to calling her Spirit after she appeared and disappeared like smoke through the pine trees, had appointed herself his constant companion. She followed him on his morning walks through the property, watched him work from whatever shade she could find, and always returned to that spot by the collapsed fence line. This morning was no different, except Spirit seemed more agitated than usual. She stood at the disturbed earth, pawing and snorting, her ears pinned back in a way that spoke of frustration. When Balen approached with his coffee, she turned those intelligent brown eyes on him and whinnied, a sound that somehow managed to convey impatience. "What is it, girl?" Balen knelt beside her, running his hand along her neck to calm her. "What's got you so worked up?" Spirit stepped back and pawed at the ground again, more deliberately this time. Her hoof struck something with a distinct metallic ring that echoed through the morning air. Then she looked at Balen expectantly, as if to say, "Well, are you going to do something about this or not?" Balen had been curious about the disturbed earth since his first day, but he'd been putting off the investigation. Something about digging into his grandfather's secrets felt like crossing a line he wasn't sure he wanted to cross. But Spirit's persistence was wearing down his resistance, and his own curiosity was getting the better of him. "All right," he said, standing and brushing dirt from his knees. "Let's see what you've been trying to show me." He fetched a shovel from the barn, one of the few tools that hadn't rusted beyond use, and returned to find Spirit standing guard over the spot like a sentinel. The earth here was softer than the surrounding soil, as if it had been disturbed and refilled. Balen began to dig carefully, his tracker's instincts telling him to go slow and pay attention to what the ground revealed. 6 inches down, his shovel struck metal with a hollow clang. Spirit nickered approvingly. Balen cleared the dirt away from what appeared to be the corner of a metal box. As he excavated around its edges, he realized it was larger than he'd first thought, maybe 2 feet long and a foot wide, made of steel that had held up well despite its burial. A heavy padlock secured the lid, green with age but still intact. It took him the better part of an hour to work the box free from the earth. When he finally lifted it clear, Spirit stepped forward and nuzzled the metal surface, breathing deeply, as if she could smell secrets locked inside. The box was heavy, not just from the metal construction, but from whatever it contained. Balen carried it back to the cabin and set it on the kitchen table. then went in search of tools to deal with the lock. He found bolt cutters in the barn, their handles wrapped in electrical tape that had seen better years. Back in the cabin, Balen paused with the cutters positioned over the lock's shackle. Once he opened this box, there would be no going back. Whatever his grandfather had buried, whatever spirit had been guarding all these years, would become his responsibility. Too late to turn back now, he murmured, and squeezed the handles. The lock parted with a sharp crack that seemed unnaturally loud in the cabin's silence. Inside the box, wrapped in oilcloth that had kept moisture at bay, lay a collection of documents that would change everything Balen thought he knew about his inheritance. The first thing he pulled out was a folded survey map, hand-drawn but precise, showing the boundaries of what he now realized was a much larger property than he'd imagined. According to the map, Thomas Murdoch's land holdings extended nearly a mile in each direction from the cabin, encompassing several square miles of forest and mountainside. But it was the notations on the map that made Balen's hands shake. Mineral survey markers dotted the property like stars, each one accompanied by notes in his grandfather's careful handwriting: silver trace, moderate; copper vein, promising; gold placer, significant; and in several locations, circled in red ink, high-grade ore confirmed. Beneath the map lay a thick sheaf of official-looking documents: mineral rights certificates, assay reports from the Montana Bureau of Mines, legal papers establishing Thomas Murdoch as the rightful owner of subsurface mining rights to the entire property. Balen spread the assay reports across the table, his eyes widening as he took in the numbers. According to the geological surveys conducted over a period of several years in the late 1980s, the property contained significant deposits of gold, silver, and copper. The estimated value, written in faded ink at the bottom of the final report, was staggering: $3.2 million, and that was based on mineral prices from 30 years ago. At current market values, the mine rights alone could be worth twice that amount, but it was the last document in the box that stopped Balen's world in its tracks. A land deed, dated 1892, transferring ownership of the original mining claim from the U.S. government to one Samuel Crow Feather, Balen's great-great-grandfather. And stapled to that deed a second document dated 1923, transferring the same rights from Samuel Crow Feather to Thomas Murdoch for the sum of $100. Balen stared at the papers, his mind racing. His ancestor had owned this land, these mineral rights, long before Thomas Murdoch arrived. But somehow, some way, those rights had been transferred to his grandfather for what amounted to pocket change. The implications hit him like a physical blow. This wasn't just an inheritance, this was stolen wealth, taken from his family generations ago and hidden away like guilty secrets. Thomas Murdoch hadn't been a benefactor leaving property to his grandson. He'd been a thief who'd somehow acquired what belonged to the Crow Feather family in the first place. Spirit appeared at the cabin's open door, as if she could sense the storm of emotions churning inside him. She walked directly to where he sat and rested her muzzle against his shoulder, a gesture of comfort that somehow made everything worse. "He stole it," Balen said aloud, his voice barely above a whisper. "All of it. The land, the mineral rights, everything. It belonged to our people and he stole it." The horse remained still, a warm presence against his shoulder, while Balen struggled to process what he'd discovered. Part of him wanted to burn the documents and walk away, to pretend he'd never found proof of his grandfather's theft. But another part, the part that had spent his life reading signs and following trails to their conclusion, knew he couldn't ignore this. Outside, a sound made both Balen and Spirit freeze. The distant rumble of a vehicle engine growing closer. Balen wasn't expecting visitors, and the nearest neighbor was 30 miles away. In his experience, unexpected visitors in remote locations rarely brought good news. He moved to the window and peered through the dusty glass. A black SUV was making its way up the dirt road, kicking up clouds of dust that hung in the still air. As it drew closer, Balen could see two figures in the front seats, men in dark clothing who moved with the kind of purposeful confidence that suggested they weren't lost tourists. Spirit had moved to stand beside him at the window, her ears forward and alert. The tension in her posture told Balen everything he needed to know about these visitors. The SUV pulled to a stop near the cabin, and two men climbed out. They were dressed in expensive outdoor gear that looked like it had never seen real wilderness use, the kind of clothes city people wore when they wanted to look rugged. Both carried themselves with the easy arrogance of men who were used to getting what they wanted. The older of the two, a man with graying temples and cold blue eyes, approached the cabin while his companion hung back near the vehicle. His smile was the kind that never reached his eyes, Mr. Crowfeather. He called out, "Mind if we have a word?" Balen gathered the documents from the table and slipped them back into the metal box, his movements careful and deliberate. Whatever these men wanted, he had a feeling it was connected to what he'd just discovered. Spirit whinnied softly, a sound of warning that raised the hair on the back of Balen's neck. He opened the cabin door and stepped onto the porch, his hand resting casually on the doorframe in a way that would let him move quickly if necessary. "Don't get many visitors out here. What can I do for you?" The man's smile widened, but those cold eyes remained calculating. "Name's Morrison. I represent certain interests that might be willing to make you a very generous offer for this property." "Not interested in selling," Balen replied simply. "Now, don't be hasty," Morrison said, taking a step closer. "You haven't even heard what we're prepared to offer. This old place isn't worth much as is. You'd be doing yourself a favor, taking our money and finding somewhere more suitable to live." Behind Morrison, his companion had moved to lean against the SUV, his jacket falling open just enough to reveal the butt of a pistol holstered at his hip. Balen's expression remained neutral, but his mind was racing. These men had arrived less than an hour after he'd discovered the mineral rights documents. "That couldn't be a coincidence, like I said," Balen repeated. "Not interested." Morrison's smile finally faded. "Maybe you should think about it a little longer, Mr. Crowfeather. Sometimes a man can get in over his head in a place like this. Accidents happen. Would hate to see you get hurt." The threat was subtle but clear. Balen felt Spirit tense beside him, as if she understood the danger these men represented. "I'll keep that in mind," Balen said evenly. Morrison stared at him for a long moment, then shrugged. "Your choice. But don't say we didn't try to do this the easy way." The two men climbed back into their SUV and drove away, leaving Balen standing on his porch with a metal box full of secrets and the growing certainty that his quiet inheritance had just become something much more dangerous. Spirit pressed against his leg, and he reached down to stroke her neck. "Looks like we're in for some trouble, girl," he murmured. "Question is, what are we going to do about it?" The brass surveyor's transit scope sat on Thomas Murdoch's desk like a relic from another century, its bronze surface tarnished, but still functional. Balen had found it while searching through his grandfather's belongings, looking for anything that might help him understand the true extent of his inheritance. After Morrison's visit, Balen knew he needed to understand exactly what he was dealing with. The documents in the buried box had shown mineral rights to a substantial piece of property, but he needed to see those boundaries for himself. More importantly, he needed to know if anyone else had been surveying his land. The old transit scope was exactly what he needed. Spirit seemed to understand his purpose as he prepared for a survey of the property lines. She followed him as he gathered the transit, a measuring chain and some wooden stakes from the barn, her movements alert and purposeful. When he slung a backpack over his shoulders and headed toward the tree line, she fell into step beside him, like a seasoned partner. The first survey marker was easier to find than Balen had expected. According to his grandfather's map, it should be located roughly a quarter-mile east of the cabin, near a distinctive rock outcropping. Spirit led him directly to it, as if she'd made this journey many times before. The marker was an iron post driven deep into the ground, its top stamped with coordinates and the date, 1892, the same year as the original land deed to Samuel Crow Feather. Balen felt a strange connection to his ancestor as he set up the transit scope and began taking measurements. What he discovered made his blood run cold. According to his calculations, the property boundaries extended much farther than he'd imagined. The original Crow Feather claim encompassed nearly 4 square miles of prime mountain forest, including several natural meadows and at least 3 streams. If the mineral surveys were accurate, this was land worth far more than the $3.2 million estimated in the 1980s, but it was what he found at the second marker that truly alarmed him. Fresh boot prints in the soft earth around the iron post. Cigarette butts that couldn't be more than a few days old. Someone had been here recently, taking their own measurements, and judging by the professional quality of the survey equipment impressions in the dirt, they weren't amateurs. Spirit snorted and pawed at the ground, her agitation clear. She'd noticed the signs too, and she didn't like what they meant. Balen knelt and examined the boot prints more carefully. 2 different sets, both from expensive hiking boots. The stride length suggested men of average height, probably the same 2 who'd visited his cabin. Morrison and his silent partner had been surveying his property, likely for some time before they'd bothered to introduce themselves. The third marker told an even more disturbing story. This one had been recently disturbed, not just surveyed, but partially excavated. Someone had dug around the base of the iron post, exposing more of its length and revealing additional markings that had been buried for over a century. Fresh survey stakes had been driven into the ground nearby, marked with the logo of a company called Apex Mining Solutions. Balen photographed everything with his phone, documenting the illegal survey work on his property. The implications were clear. Morrison and his people weren't just interested in buying his land. They were actively preparing to claim it, with or without his permission. As he worked his way around the perimeter of his property, Spirit proved to be an invaluable guide. She seemed to know the location of every marker, every significant geological feature, every trail that connected one section to another. More than once, she led him to evidence of recent trespassing, tire tracks from ATVs, campsites that had been used and abandoned. Even a few pieces of high-tech surveying equipment that had been hastily hidden. At the 4th marker, Balen made a discovery that changed his understanding of the entire situation. A small canvas tarp had been spread over what appeared to be a test drilling site. Someone had used a portable core drill to extract samples from the ground, leaving behind a neat pile of stone and metal fragments. The samples had been carefully labeled and organized. Clearly the work of professional geologists, but it was the assay report tucked under a corner of the tarp that made Balen's hands shake as he read it. The preliminary analysis showed gold content far higher than anything indicated in his grandfather's documents. According to the report dated just 2 weeks ago, this single test site contained ore worth potentially millions of dollars per ton. And this was just one location on a property that contained dozens of similar deposits. Someone had been conducting illegal mineral surveys on his land, and they'd discovered a fortune that dwarfed even the impressive estimates from the 1980s. Spirit had been watching the tree line while Balen studied the report, her ears swiveling to track sounds he couldn't hear. Suddenly, she tensed, a low rumble building in her chest, not quite a whinny, but a sound of warning. Balen looked up to see sunlight glinting off something in the pines about 200 yards away. Binoculars, he realized. Someone was watching them, moving slowly and casually, as if he hadn't noticed the surveillance. Balen folded the assay report and slipped it into his backpack. He gathered his surveying equipment and began walking back toward the cabin, Spirit staying close to his side. But instead of taking the direct route, he chose a path that would lead them through dense forest, where observation would be more difficult. Once they were out of sight from the survey site, Balen changed course again, using his tracking skills to approach the watchers from an unexpected direction. He found their camp in a small clearing overlooking his property. Two men in camouflage clothing had set up a professional surveillance operation, complete with high-powered scopes, communication equipment, and enough supplies to suggest they'd been there for several days. Neither of them was Morrison or his partner. These were different men, younger, fitter, with the kind of military bearing that suggested special training. They'd positioned themselves to watch both his cabin and the survey site, recording his movements and activities. Balen documented their camp with his phone, careful to stay hidden in the tree line. These weren't casual trespassers or even corporate security. These men looked like mercenaries, and their presence on his property was definitely illegal. As he prepared to withdraw, Spirit's warning rumble alerted him to movement. A third man was approaching the camp from the north, carrying what appeared to be additional communications equipment. Balen recognized him immediately. Morrison's silent partner from yesterday's visit. The man was speaking into a radio as he walked, and even from a distance Balen could make out fragments of the conversation. Confirmed. The location, drilling samples positive, subject. Is mapping the boundaries. Recommend immediate. The transmission broke up as the man moved behind a screen of trees. But Balen had heard enough. Whatever Apex Mining Solutions was planning, it was happening soon. And he was definitely not part of their plans. He withdrew carefully, Spirit moving like a ghost beside him through the forest. By the time they reached the cabin, Balen had made several important decisions. First, he needed to secure the mineral rights documents somewhere these people couldn't get to them. Second, he needed to contact the authorities, though he wasn't sure who he could trust in a situation that involved this much money. Third, he needed to prepare for the possibility that Morrison and his people might decide to take more direct action. As if reading his thoughts, Spirit walked to the barn and stood beside a stall that Balen had assumed was empty. But when he investigated, he found it contained something his grandfather had left behind, a rifle case containing a well-maintained Winchester Model 70, along with several boxes of ammunition. Thomas Murdoch had been prepared for trouble. Now it was Balen's turn to decide how far he was willing to go to protect what was rightfully his. Outside, the sun was setting behind the pines, and somewhere in those shadows, armed men were watching his cabin and planning their next move. The photograph changed everything. Balen had been searching through his grandfather's belongings for the third time, looking for anything he might have missed that could explain the connection between Thomas Murdoch and the Crow Feather family. What he found, tucked between the pages of an old mining journal, was a family portrait that made him question everything he thought he knew about his inheritance. The black and white photograph was professionally taken, probably in the 1960s, based on the clothing and styling. It showed a younger Thomas Murdoch standing beside a beautiful Apache woman who wore traditional dress mixed with modern elements. Between them stood a boy of perhaps 8 years old, his features clearly showing mixed heritage. All three were smiling, and the body language suggested genuine affection between them. But it was the horse in the background that confirmed what Balen had begun to suspect. Spirit, or her mother, judging by the remarkable similarity, stood behind the family group, her distinctive white blaze and intelligent eyes immediately recognizable. The horse had been part of this family, which meant she had been waiting on this property not just for any owner, but for the return of people she had known and loved. The back of the photograph bore an inscription in Thomas Murdoch's careful handwriting: Sarah, Tommy, and Spirit. Our last summer together. 1967, Tommy, that would be Balen's father, who had died when Balen was 12. The father, who had rarely spoken of his childhood, who had carried a sadness that seemed to go deeper than the usual hardships of reservation life. Suddenly, pieces of the puzzle began falling into place. Sarah was Balen's grandmother, the Apache woman his father had mentioned in whispered conversations with other elders. Thomas Murdoch hadn't stolen the mineral rights from some distant ancestor. He had acquired them through marriage into the Crow Feather family, then held on to them after tragedy tore that family apart. But what tragedy? And why had his father never spoken of this man who was apparently his stepfather? Balen found more answers in his grandfather's journal, in entries that became progressively more painful to read. August 15th, 1968. Sarah is getting worse. The doctors in Kalispell don't understand what they're dealing with. I've tried everything, spent everything, but the cancer doesn't care about love or money or promises. Tommy asks me every day when his mother is coming home. I don't know what to tell him. November 3rd, 1968. Sarah died this morning. Tommy was holding her hand when she passed. I've never seen a child cry the way he cried today. I don't think I'll ever get that sound out of my head. December 20th, 1968. Tommy's uncle came for him today. Says the boy belongs with his people, not with some white man who doesn't understand their ways. Maybe he's right. Maybe I've been fooling myself thinking I could be the father Tommy needs. The boy didn't even look back when they drove away. January 10th, 1969. Tried to visit Tommy on the reservation today. His uncle wouldn't let me see him, said it would only confuse the boy. Legal papers came yesterday. They want to terminate my parental rights. Maybe it's for the best, but it feels like losing Sarah all over again. Balen closed the journal, his throat tight with emotion. Thomas Murdoch hadn't been a thief or a swindler. He had been a man who married into the Crow Feather family, who had loved Balen's grandmother and tried to raise his father. When Sarah died, the family had torn apart, leaving Thomas alone with his guilt and grief, and a young boy who grew up believing he had been abandoned by another white man. No wonder his father had never spoken of Thomas. The pain of that separation must have lasted his entire life. Spirit appeared at the cabin door, as if she sensed the emotional weight of his discovery. She walked directly to him and rested her head against his shoulder, the same comforting gesture she had offered before. But now Balen understood its deeper meaning. She wasn't just offering comfort to a stranger. She was greeting the grandson of the boy she had known and loved decades ago. "You remember him, don't you, girl?" Balen said softly, stroking her neck. "You remember my father when he was young?" Spirit nickered quietly, a sound that seemed to carry decades of patience and loyalty. But the emotional revelation was interrupted by a more immediate concern. Through the cabin window, Balen could see fresh tire tracks in the dirt near his truck. Someone had been here while he was out surveying the property, and judging by the depth of the impressions, they had been carrying significant weight. A careful search of the cabin revealed what they had been after. The hidden spaces where Thomas had kept his most important documents had been expertly searched. Drawers had been opened and closed, papers had been moved and replaced, and his grandfather's desk showed signs of having been examined with professional thoroughness. They had been looking for the mineral rights documents. But thanks to Balen's paranoia, those papers were now secured in a safety deposit box at the bank in Kalispell. Still, the violation felt personal, and the message was clear. Morrison and his people were done asking politely. That evening, as Balen sat on the cabin porch watching the sunset, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. Reflected light was flashing from multiple positions in the tree line surrounding his property. Someone was signaling between positions, coordinating what looked like a surveillance network that completely encircled his cabin. Spirit, who had been grazing peacefully in the meadow, suddenly lifted her head and trotted back toward the cabin. Her ears were pinned back, and she kept looking toward the trees with obvious agitation. Balen counted at least 6 different positions where he could detect signs of human presence. These weren't the casual watchers he had discovered earlier. This was a coordinated operation involving multiple teams, and it suggested that Morrison's people were preparing for something more aggressive than simple intimidation. Using his tracking skills and the cover of darkness, Balen made a careful reconnaissance of his perimeter. What he found confirmed his worst fears. Professional mercenaries had established observation posts at every major approach to his property. They had night vision equipment, communication gear, and enough firepower to handle any resistance he might offer, but they had made one crucial mistake. They had positioned themselves like military operators attacking a conventional target. not like hunters dealing with someone who had spent his entire life moving unseen through wilderness terrain. Balen knew these mountains, these forests, these hidden trails that didn't appear on any map. More importantly, he knew how to use the land itself as both weapon and shield. If Morrison wanted a confrontation, he would get one, but not on the terms he expected. That night, Balen began his own preparations. He moved supplies to hidden caches throughout his property using trails and shelter points that Thomas had established decades earlier. He set up communication points that would allow him to monitor his enemy's movements without exposing his own position. Most importantly, he began to understand that this fight was about more than money or mineral rights. This was about justice delayed, about family secrets that had festered in darkness for too long, and about whether a man could reclaim what had been stolen from his people without losing his soul in the process. Spirit seemed to understand the gravity of the situation. She stayed close to the cabin, alert and watchful, occasionally raising her head to test the wind for scents that didn't belong. In the distance, radio chatter echoed faintly through the trees as Morrison's mercenaries coordinated their positions. They thought they had trapped a simple tracker in a remote cabin. They had no idea they were dealing with a man who had spent his entire life becoming invisible in places exactly like this. The corporate survey stakes appeared overnight, like steel weeds sprouting from his ancestral ground. Balen discovered them during his morning reconnaissance. Bright orange flags attached to metal stakes driven deep into the earth at precise intervals across his property. Each stake bore the Apex Mining Solutions logo and a series of numbers that clearly represented some kind of grid system. What made his jaw clench was the brazenness of it all. These weren't hidden survey markers placed discreetly during the night. They were a statement of ownership, planted in broad daylight by people who apparently believed they had already won whatever game they were playing. Spirit shared his anger. The horse had been agitated since dawn, pacing restlessly around the cabin and whinnying at sounds only she could hear. When Balen led her out to investigate the survey stakes, she became almost violent in her reaction, rearing and striking at the nearest marker with her hooves until he was forced to calm her. "Easy, girl," he said, stroking her neck. "I know how you feel, but we need to be smart about this." The stakes formed a pattern that became clear as Balen mapped their locations. They outlined not just his inherited property, but several adjoining parcels that included old mining claims and timber rights. Someone was planning a major extraction operation, and they were treating his land as if it were already part of their holdings. At the fifth stake, Balen found something that made his blood boil. A corporate survey team was actually working. 3 men in matching Apex Mining coveralls, using professional equipment to measure and document the terrain. They moved with the casual confidence of people who believed they had every right to be there. Talking and laughing as they violated his property, Balen approached them with the quiet step that had made him legendary among the hunters he guided. They didn't notice him until he spoke. "Morning, gentlemen. Mind telling me what you're doing on my land?" The 3 men spun around, startled. The team leader, a soft-looking man with pale hands and expensive boots, recovered quickly and put on what was probably meant to be a diplomatic smile. "Oh, hello there. You must be Mr. Crowfeather. I'm Jenkins from Apex Mining. I think there's been some confusion about the ownership status of this property." "No confusion on my end," Balen replied evenly. "This is my land. You're trespassing." Jenkins pulled out a folder and extracted several official-looking documents. "Actually, sir, I think you'll find that's not quite accurate. We've filed claims on several mineral rights in this area, and our legal team has identified some irregularities in your grandfather's original documentation." Balen didn't need to examine the papers to know they were fraudulent. But Jenkins's casual confidence suggested that Apex had resources that went far beyond simple corporate lawyers. They were operating with the kind of authority that came from having judges and officials in their pocket. "Get off my property," Balen said simply. Jenkins' smile faded. "Now, Mr. Crowfeather, there's no need for hostility. We're prepared to offer you very fair compensation for any inconvenience. Get off my property, now!" The other two surveyors had stopped working and were watching the confrontation with obvious nervousness. These men weren't fighters. They were technicians who had expected to do their work without interference. But Jenkins was different. His pale eyes hardened as he studied Balen, and his voice took on an edge of threat. "I'm afraid we can't do that, sir. We have legal authority to conduct these surveys, and we intend to complete our work. If you interfere with our operations, we'll be forced to contact law enforcement." "Feel free," Balen replied. "I'd be happy to discuss trespassing laws with the sheriff." For a moment, the two men stared at each other in silence. Then Jenkins smiled again, but this time the expression was predatory. "You know, Mr. Crowfeather, accidents happen in remote locations like this. Equipment malfunctions, people get lost. Sometimes folks just disappear entirely. It would be a shame if something happened to you out here, all alone with nobody to help." The threat was barely veiled, but it was clear enough. Balen felt something cold and familiar settle in his chest, the same feeling he'd had in Afghanistan when enemy fighters had tried to intimidate his unit. It hadn't worked then, and it wouldn't work now. "You're right about one thing," Balen said quietly. "Accidents do happen in places like this, especially to people who don't know the terrain." Jenkins took a step back, perhaps recognizing something dangerous in Balen's tone. After a moment, he gestured to his team. "Pack it up, boys. We'll finish this section tomorrow." As the three men gathered their equipment, Jenkins turned back to Balen with one final attempt at intimidation. "This isn't over, Mr. Crowfeather. You're fighting people with resources you can't imagine. It would be much easier for everyone if you just took our offer and walked away." "I'll keep that in mind," Balen replied. After the survey team left, Balen spent the rest of the day systematically removing every corporate stake from his property. It was exhausting work. The stakes had been driven deep and required significant effort to extract, but he was determined to clear every trace of Apex's presumptive claim from his land. Spirit helped by showing him stakes he had missed, leading him to markers that had been placed in particularly hidden locations. Her knowledge of the property continued to amaze him, as if she had been surveying these boundaries for decades. That evening, Balen drove into Kalispell to do some research at the public library. What he discovered about Apex Mining Solutions confirmed his worst suspicions about the company he was fighting. Apex had a long history of acquiring mineral rights through questionable legal maneuvers, often targeting properties owned by minorities or people without the resources to fight extended court battles. Their standard operating procedure involved filing competing claims based on technicalities in original documentation, then using political pressure and intimidation to force settlements. But what truly alarmed Balen were the newspaper reports about property owners who had refused to cooperate with Apex's acquisition efforts. 3 men in different states had died in accidents while defending their mining claims. 2 had been found at the bottom of abandoned mine shafts. 1 had simply disappeared, his body never recovered. The pattern was clear, and Balen realized he was dealing with people who viewed murder as an acceptable business expense. On his drive back to the ranch, Balen noticed headlights following him at a discreet distance. The vehicle maintained perfect spacing, hanging back just far enough to avoid detection by casual observation. But Balen's tracking instincts had been honed by years in environments where such awareness meant the difference between life and death. Instead of driving directly home, he took a circuitous route through back roads and logging trails, confirming that he was indeed being followed by professionals who knew how to conduct mobile surveillance. When he finally reached his property, the pursuing vehicle drove past without slowing, but Balen caught enough of a glimpse to identify it as the same black SUV Morrison had been driving. They weren't just planning to steal his land, they were studying his routines, looking for patterns they could exploit. That night, as Balen prepared for what he now understood would be an escalating conflict, Spirit stood guard outside his cabin like a sentinel. Her presence was reassuring, but it also reminded him of the stakes involved. This wasn't just about money or mineral rights anymore. This was about honor, about family legacy, and about whether justice could still prevail when powerful corporations decided they wanted what belonged to someone else. In the distance, he could see the glow of campfires in the tree line where Morrison's mercenaries had established their positions. They thought they had him surrounded, but they didn't understand that he had been preparing for this fight his entire life. Tomorrow, the real war would begin. The hand-carved medicine pouch had been hidden behind a loose floorboard beneath his grandmother's bed, a place Balen discovered only after Spirit led him there, pawing insistently at the wooden planks until he investigated. Inside the small leather pouch, worn smooth by decades of handling, Balen found items that connected him to a heritage he had only glimpsed in childhood stories. Sacred sage, still fragrant after all these years. A small piece of turquoise carved with symbols he didn't recognize, but somehow understood. A braid of sweetgrass that seemed to carry the essence of prairie, wines and grandmother's songs, but it was the folded piece of paper tucked beneath. These sacred items that brought tears to his eyes. Written in his grandmother's careful script were the words, "For my grandson's son, when the time comes to choose between what is easy and what is right. Your ancestors walk with you. Trust the horse. She remembers everything." Sarah had known. Somehow, she had known that one day her great-grandson would inherit this burden, this choice between justice and safety. She had left him the spiritual tools he would need to find his way through the darkness ahead. That same afternoon, Balen's water well stopped working. At first, he assumed it was a mechanical failure. The pump was old, and mountain wells sometimes had issues with debris or electrical problems. But when he pulled the pump housing, he found something that made his hands shake with rage. Someone had poured industrial solvent into his well, contaminating the water supply with chemicals that would take months to filter out naturally. The sabotage was professional and thorough, designed not just to inconvenience him, but to make the property uninhabitable. Spirit had been avoiding the water trough all morning, her animal instincts warning her away from the contaminated source. Now Balen understood her behavior. She had been trying to protect both of them from poisoning. The message was clear. Apex Mining Solutions was done with subtle pressure. They were moving to direct action, making his life impossible in hopes of forcing him to sell and leave, but they had underestimated both his resolve and his resourcefulness. Balen spent the next 2 days establishing alternative water sources, using knowledge his grandfather had preserved about natural springs and seasonal streams. Thomas Murdoch's journals contained detailed maps of the property's water table, information that proved invaluable as Balen set up a network of supply points that would be difficult for saboteurs to locate. During this work, Spirit proved herself an invaluable partner. She seemed to know the location of every water source on the property, leading him to springs he never would have found on his own. More importantly, her behavior served as an early warning system. She could detect the presence of strangers on the property long before Balen's own senses picked up the signs. It was Spirit's alert that saved his life. When the next attack came, Balen had been working on a remote spring near the eastern boundary of his property when Spirit suddenly froze, her ears forward and her body tense. She was staring at a stand of pine trees about 100 yards away, focusing on something Balen couldn't see, moving with the stealth that had kept him alive in Afghanistan. Balen approached the tree line from an angle that would give him cover. What he found there made his blood run cold. A professional sniper had established a hide in the pines, complete with camouflaged shooting position and high-powered rifle equipped with a precision scope. The man was dressed in full ghillie suit and had been waiting for Balen to enter his kill zone. If Spirit hadn't detected the threat, Balen would have walked directly into the sniper's crosshairs. Instead, he was able to circle around and approach the shooter from behind, using techniques he had learned during his military service. The man was focused entirely on the spring, where Balen had been working, waiting patiently for his target to return. Balen could have killed him, should have killed him, according to the laws of war and self-defense. But something his grandmother's spirit seemed to whisper in his ear held him back from taking a life unless absolutely necessary. Instead, he used a sleeper hold that rendered the sniper unconscious in seconds. When the man woke up, he found himself zip-tied to a tree with Balen sitting cross-legged in front of him, the confiscated rifle broken down into components at his feet. "Morning," Balen said conversationally. "Nice day for attempted murder." The sniper was younger than Balen had expected, probably in his late 20s, with the kind of military bearing that suggested recent discharge from special operations. His eyes held the flat emptiness that Balen recognized from his own time in combat zones. "You don't understand what you're getting into," the young man said. "These people don't make idle threats." "What people?" "Apex isn't just a mining company. They're connected to some very dangerous individuals, people who make problems disappear permanently. You should take their offer and disappear before they decide you're too much trouble to keep alive." Balen studied the young mercenary for a moment, seeing something familiar in his bearing. "What unit were you with?" "Rangers. 3rd Battalion. Got out 2 years ago. Afghanistan. 3 tours." Balen nodded slowly. "I was there too. Different unit, same war. What's your name, Ranger?" The young man hesitated, then answered, "Campbell. Sergeant First Class, retired." "Well, Campbell, I'm going to give you some advice that might save your life. You're working for the wrong people, and you're about to get caught in a situation that won't end well for anyone." Campbell's expression didn't change, but Balen could see doubt beginning to creep into his eyes. "I've got bills to pay and a family to feed. This job pays well." "Dead men don't pay bills," Balen replied. "And this job is going to get you killed, because the people you're working for don't care about you any more than they care about me." Balen cut the zip ties and stepped back, giving Campbell room to move. "You've got a choice to make, brother. You can walk away from this now, or you can stick around and see how bad this situation gets. But if I see you on my property again, I won't be as understanding." Campbell gathered his equipment in silence, his movements careful and non-threatening. As he prepared to leave, he turned back to Balen with something like respect in his eyes. "You know they're not going to stop. Morrison has orders to acquire this property by any means necessary. If intimidation doesn't work, they'll escalate to direct action." "Let them," Balen replied. "This is my family's land, and I'm not going anywhere." That evening, as Balen performed the evening ritual with his grandmother's medicine pouch, burning sage and offering prayers for guidance, Spirit stood beside him like a guardian spirit made flesh. The sacred smoke rose into the mountain air, carrying his intentions and fears to the ancestors who had walked this land before him. In that moment, Balen felt the presence of generations of crow-feather warriors, men and women who had fought impossible odds to protect what was precious to them. He was not alone in this fight. He never had been. The spirits of his people walked with him, and tomorrow he would show Morrison and Apex Mining exactly what it meant to threaten a man who carried the strength of his ancestors in his heart. The sheriff's badge from 1892 lay in Balen's palm like a piece of forgotten history, its silver surface tarnished but still bearing the clear impression of authority from another century. He had found it in the last place he would have expected, hidden inside Spirit's feed bucket in the barn, wrapped in oilcloth that had protected it from decades of mountain weather. The horse had led him there, nickering insistently and pawing at the bucket until he investigated. But it wasn't just the badge that stopped his world. It was the name engraved on the back, Sheriff Thomas Murdoch, Flathead County, Montana Territory. Thomas Murdoch hadn't been a claim jumper or land speculator. He'd been a lawman, sworn to uphold justice in the wild territory that would become modern Montana. And according to the documents Balen found with the badge, he had been specifically assigned to protect Apache land rights. During the turbulent period when the federal government was redrawing tribal boundaries, the revelation forced Balen to re-examine everything he thought he knew about his grandfather's story. More documents had been hidden with the badge, newspaper clippings, official reports, and personal letters that painted a picture of a young sheriff caught between impossible pressures. Thomas Murdoch had been trying to protect Apache families from mining companies that were using fraud and violence to steal tribal lands. But the corruption went all the way to the territorial capital, and Thomas found himself fighting not just criminals, but the very system he had sworn to serve. One newspaper clipping from 1893 told a story that made Balen's chest tight with recognition. Sheriff Murdoch prevents massacre at Crow Feather Mine yesterday. Sheriff Thomas Murdoch of Flathead County prevented what could have been a bloody confrontation between Apache families and armed miners seeking to claim mineral rights on tribal land. The miners, employed by Eastern interests, had been using forged documents to justify their occupation of Apache territory. Sheriff Murdoch, accompanied by his Apache deputy Samuel Crow Feather, confronted the miners and ordered them to withdraw pending resolution of the legal disputes. When the miners refused and threatened violence against Apache women and children, Sheriff Murdoch arrested the entire group and confiscated their weapons. "The law applies to everyone equally," Sheriff Murdoch told this reporter. "No mining company, no matter how well connected, has the right to terrorize innocent families." Samuel Crow Feather, Balen's great-great-grandfather, hadn't just owned the mineral rights. He had been Thomas Murdoch's deputy, his partner in protecting Apache land from corporate thieves. But the next clipping, dated 6 months later, told a darker story. Sheriff Murdoch under investigation. Territorial authorities are investigating allegations of corruption against Sheriff Thomas Murdoch following complaints from mining interests. Murdoch is accused of accepting bribes to prevent legitimate mining operations and of showing favoritism toward Apache, claims that may lack proper documentation. Deputy Samuel Crow Feather was found dead yesterday in what authorities are calling a hunting accident. Crow Feather had been scheduled to testify in support of Sheriff Murdoch's actions. The pieces were falling into place now, creating a picture that was both heartbreaking and enraging. Thomas Murdoch had tried to protect Apache land rights, but the mining companies had corrupted the system against him. They had murdered his Apache partner and friend, then used political pressure to force Thomas into an impossible choice. The final document in the collection was a letter in Thomas's handwriting, apparently never sent to whom it may concern. "I write this as my final official act as Sheriff of Flathead County. The territorial government has made it clear that I must choose between my oath to uphold justice and my own survival. They want me to validate the fraudulent mining claims that led to Samuel Crow Feather's murder, or face charges that will destroy my reputation and quite possibly my life. I cannot validate theft, and I cannot abandon the families I swore to protect. Therefore, I am taking the mineral rights into my own custody, not to profit from them, but to preserve them until such time as they can be returned to their rightful owners, Samuel's descendants. If I do not survive the coming confrontation with the mining interests, let this letter serve as evidence that the Crow Feather family's claims are legitimate, and that the mineral rights belong to them by law, not by the corruption that passes for justice in this territory. The mare spirit belonged to Samuel. She knows the location of every survey marker, every hidden cache, every piece of evidence that proves the truth of these claims. Trust her judgment. She remembers everything. Thomas Murdoch, former sheriff, Flathead County, Balen, sat in stunned silence, processing the magnitude of what he had discovered. His grandfather hadn't stolen anything. He had risked everything, his career, his reputation, his life, to protect Apache land rights from the same kind of corporate corruption that was threatening those rights today. The mineral rights transfer from Samuel Crow Feather to Thomas Murdoch hadn't been a swindle. It had been a desperate attempt to preserve the family's claim by putting it in the hands of someone the corrupt territorial government couldn't easily eliminate. Thomas had spent the rest of his life as a guardian, protecting wealth that legally belonged to the Crow Feather family until the day when it could be safely returned. His marriage to Sarah hadn't been opportunistic. It had been love, complicated by the tragedy and violence that had forced them together. And when Sarah died and the family was scattered, Thomas had continued his guardianship alone, waiting for the day when Samuel's great-great-grandson would be ready to reclaim what had always belonged to his people. But the revelation raised an even more disturbing question. If Apex Mining Solutions knew about the historical mineral rights, did they also know about the murders that had been committed to steal those rights originally? Balen found his answer in a manila envelope that Spirit led him to, hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the barn. Inside were modern documents, corporate communications, legal briefs, and financial records that painted a picture of conspiracy stretching back decades. Apex Mining Solutions wasn't just another mining company. It was the modern incarnation of the same Eastern interests that had tried to steal Apache land in the 1890s. The company had been specifically created to acquire mineral rights that the original mining syndicate had been unable to claim through legal means. But most shocking of all were the internal memos discussing Thomas Murdoch's death 5 years earlier. According to corporate communications, Thomas hadn't died of natural causes as the official records indicated. He had been murdered by Apex operatives after he refused to sign over the mineral rights voluntarily. The company had then spent 5 years tracking down his heirs, planning to acquire the property through a combination of legal manipulation and intimidation. They had killed Balen's grandfather, just as their predecessors had killed his great-great-grandfather over a century before. The pattern of corporate violence that had begun in territorial Montana was continuing into the present day, with the same families being targeted by the same criminal interests across multiple generations. But there was one final document that changed everything, a detailed corporate plan outlining Apex's current strategy for acquiring the Crow Feather mineral rights. Morrison wasn't just a corporate negotiator. He was the operational commander of a mercenary unit with orders to eliminate any resistance to Apex's acquisition of the property. The company had invested too much money and too many years in this operation to allow one stubborn Apache tracker to derail their plans. According to the timeline laid out in the corporate memos, Apex had scheduled Balen's elimination for the following night. They would stage it as an accident, probably a fire that would destroy both the cabin and any evidence of their involvement. With Balen dead and the property vacant, they could complete their mineral rights acquisition without further interference. But they had made one crucial mistake in their planning. They assumed Balen was just another victim, like his grandfather and great-great-grandfather before him. They didn't understand that he was a man who had spent his entire life preparing for exactly this kind of fight. As Balen studied the corporate documents by lamplight, Spirit stood guard outside the cabin, her senses alert for any sign of approaching danger. Tomorrow night, the final confrontation would come. But now Balen understood exactly what he was fighting for, and exactly what his enemies were capable of. This wasn't just about mineral rights or money. This was about justice delayed for over a century, about family honor that had been attacked across multiple generations, and about whether corporate criminals could continue to profit from murder and theft. Thomas Murdoch had been unable to complete his mission to protect Apache land rights, but he had preserved everything his great-grandson would need to finish what he had started. The badge felt warm in Balen's palm, as if it carried the strength and determination of the lawman who had worn it into battle against impossible odds. Tomorrow, Sheriff Thomas Murdoch's legacy would finally be fulfilled. The Winchester rifle model 1894 felt familiar in Balen's hands, the same model his grandfather had carried as a territorial sheriff, probably the same weapon that had stood between Apache families and corporate murderers over a century ago. Thomas had maintained it perfectly, the action smooth and precise despite its age. Along with the rifle, Balen had found cases of ammunition, gun oil, and detailed notes about sight adjustments and ballistics. His grandfather had been preparing for this confrontation long before Balen inherited the responsibility. As dawn broke over the Montana mountains, Balen completed his final preparations for what he knew would be a fight to the death. The corporate documents had been clear about Apex's timeline. Morrison's mercenaries would move tonight, using the cover of darkness to eliminate him and destroy any evidence of their crimes. They had superior numbers, better equipment, and the backing of unlimited corporate resources, but they were fighting on his ground, against someone who understood every tree, every trail, every hiding place on the property they intended to steal. Balen had spent the morning setting up defensive positions throughout his territory. Using techniques Thomas had documented in his sheriff's notes and tactics Balen had learned during his military service. The combination of 19th-century guerrilla warfare and modern special operations created a defensive strategy his enemies wouldn't expect. Spirit had been invaluable in this preparation, leading him to concealed positions his grandfather had established decades earlier. Hidden caches of ammunition and supplies were scattered throughout the property, along with communication points and escape routes that would allow Balen to move unseen between defensive positions. But it was the spiritual preparation that gave him the strength he needed for what was coming, following the instructions in his grandmother's letter. Balen had spent the afternoon in ceremony, burning sage and sweetgrass while holding the sacred items from her medicine pouch. As the fragrant smoke rose into the mountain air, he felt the presence of his ancestors, not just Thomas and Sarah, but generations of crow-feather warriors who had fought impossible odds to protect what was sacred to them. Samuel Crow, Feather's spirit, seemed especially close, as if the murdered deputy was ready to see justice finally served after more than a century of waiting. "I won't let them win," Balen said aloud, addressing the spirits of his family. Not this time. The afternoon brought unwelcome visitors. Morrison arrived with a convoy of black SUVs, carrying at least a dozen men in tactical gear. But this wasn't the small surveillance team Balen had been evading for weeks. These were professional soldiers, armed with military-grade weapons and equipment that looked like it belonged in a war zone. From his concealed observation post, Balen watched through binoculars as Morrison's force established a command post near the property's main access road. They moved with the precision of a military unit, setting up communication equipment, weapons platforms, and what appeared to be heavy machinery designed for demolition work. They weren't just planning to kill him. They were preparing to erase every trace of his presence from the property. But Morrison made his first mistake when he decided to offer Balen one final chance to surrender. The corporate commander approached the cabin under a white flag, accompanied by two bodyguards who looked like former special operations soldiers. Balen met them on the porch, the Winchester cradled casually in his arms. "Mr. Crow-Feather," Morrison said, his voice carrying mock concern. "I think we've gotten off on the wrong foot. My employers are prepared to make you a very generous final offer." "I'm listening," Balen replied. Morrison smiled, but his eyes remained cold. $10 million cash for your immediate departure from this property. You sign the transfer papers, pack your belongings, and drive away tonight. No questions asked, no legal complications. And if I refuse, then you'll unfortunately be caught in the tragic fire that destroys this old cabin tonight. Such a shame when these historical properties go up in flames, especially with the owner inside. Balen studied Morrison's face, seeing the absolute confidence of a man who had never lost this kind of confrontation. "You killed my grandfather the same way, didn't you?" Morrison's smile widened. Thomas Murdoch was a stubborn old man who refused to see reason. He thought he could protect something that was already lost. "Don't make the same mistake. What if I told you that I've already transferred copies of all the historical documents to a lawyer in Kalispell, including the evidence that proves Apex murdered Thomas Murdoch and Samuel Crow-Feather?" For the first time, Morrison's confidence faltered slightly. "You're bluffing, am I?" Balen reached into his jacket and pulled out a cell phone. "One call to the FBI field office in Great Falls, and this entire operation becomes a federal investigation into murder and racketeering." Morrison's hand moved toward his concealed weapon, but Balen's rifle was already trained on his center mass. "I wouldn't," Balen said quietly. "Your men are watching through rifle scopes, but they can't get a clean shot without risking your life. And my first round goes through your heart before anyone can react." The standoff lasted for 30 seconds that felt like hours. Finally, Morrison stepped back, his hands visible and empty. "You're making a serious mistake, Mr. Crowfeather. My employers don't like complications." "Then tell your employers that they're about to experience the biggest complication of their corporate lives," Balen replied. "This property belongs to my family, and I'm prepared to die defending it. The question is, how many of your mercenaries are prepared to die trying to take it?" Morrison turned and walked back to his command post, but not before giving Balen a look that promised violence. "This isn't over," he called back. "No," Balen agreed. "It isn't." As Morrison's convoy withdrew to establish a siege perimeter around the property, Balen made his final preparations for the coming battle. He moved Spirit to a concealed shelter deep in the forest, far from the cabin where the fighting would be concentrated. The horse seemed to understand the danger, nuzzling his face before trotting away into the darkness. Then Balen activated the communication device he had purchased in Gallispell, a satellite phone that would allow him to contact the outside world, even if Morrison's people jammed conventional cellular service. His first call was to the Blackfeet Reservation Police, reporting the presence of armed trespassers on his property. His second was to the FBI field office, requesting immediate assistance with an ongoing threat from a criminal organization. But his most important call was to his cousin Joseph, who served on the tribal council. "Joseph, it's Balen. I need you to gather as many of our people as you can and get them to the old Murdoch place tonight." "What's going on, cousin?" "The same people who've been stealing our land for 100 years are making their final move. I need backup." Joseph's voice grew serious. "How many men do you need?" "As many as are willing to fight for what belongs to us." "We'll be there," Joseph promised. "How long do you need us to hold them off?" "Until dawn. If I can survive until sunrise, the cavalry will arrive in the form of federal agents and enough media attention to shut down this operation permanently." As the sun set behind the Montana peaks, Balen took position in his primary defensive site, a rocky outcropping that gave him command of the approaches to his cabin while providing excellent cover from return fire. The Winchester lay across a rifle rest. Thomas had carved from mountain pine, its barrel trained on the most likely avenue of attack. Extra ammunition was within easy reach, along with emergency supplies and communication equipment. In the distance, he could see the lights of Morrison's command post, where mercenaries were preparing for their assault on what they believed was a single, isolated target. They had no idea they were about to face the combined fury of a man defending his ancestral home and the spirits of generations who had died protecting the same ground. As full darkness settled over the mountains, Balen heard the first sounds of approaching vehicles. Morrison's final assault was beginning, but this time the outcome would be different. This time, justice would not be denied. The Winchester felt warm in his hands, as if it carried the strength of every lawman and warrior who had wielded it in defense of the innocent. "Come on, then," Balen whispered into the mountain darkness. "Let's finish what you started 100 years ago." The emergency flare gun lay within easy reach as Morrison's mercenaries began their assault on the cabin. Moving through the darkness like shadows seeking blood, Balen had positioned himself on the rocky outcropping 50 yards from his grandfather's cabin, watching through night vision scope as tactical teams approached from 3 directions. They moved with professional precision, but they were operating on the assumption that their target was trapped inside the building they intended to destroy. They had no idea he was watching them from above, counting their numbers and marking their positions. 12 men total, 4 approaching from the east through dense pine cover. 4 more moving up the creek bed from the south. The remaining 4, including Morrison, were establishing overwatch positions on the ridge opposite Balen's location. Their plan was textbook: surround the target, eliminate escape routes, then use overwhelming firepower to destroy the building and anyone inside. It would have worked against most targets, but Balen wasn't most targets. The first mercenary team reached the cabin's porch at exactly 2:17 a.m. Through his scope, Balen watched them stack up beside the front door, preparing to breach with explosive charges. Professional soldiers, following standard urban warfare protocols, Balen let them complete their preparations. Let them feel confident. Let them believe they held every advantage. Then he opened fire. The Winchester's first shot dropped the team leader as he reached for the door handle. The second shot shattered the explosive charge in the hands of the breacher, sending the entire team diving for cover as their own equipment turned into deadly shrapnel. Chaos erupted across the property as the remaining mercenaries realized their target wasn't where they expected him to be. Radio chatter filled the night. Era's team leaders tried to locate Balen's firing position while maintaining their assault formation. But Balen was already moving using trails his grandfather had mapped decades earlier. He flowed through the darkness like smoke, appearing long enough to take precise shots at exposed targets before vanishing back into the forest. The mercenaries' night vision equipment was excellent, but it couldn't track someone who understood every shadow, every fold in the terrain, every hiding place the mountain offered. The second team, advancing from the creek bed, found themselves under fire from what seemed like multiple positions as Balen used the acoustic properties of the rocky terrain to mask his true location. 2 more mercenaries went down before their teammates could establish effective return fire. Morrison's voice crackled over their radio communications, fury replacing the confident professionalism of an hour earlier. "Where the hell is he? Find him and put him down." But finding Balen proved easier said than done. He had spent weeks preparing this battlefield, memorizing every approach route and escape path. More importantly, he was fighting for something the mercenaries couldn't understand. Not just property or mineral rights, but family honor that stretched back generations. The third engagement came when Morrison's Overwatch team tried to reposition for a better angle on Balen's suspected hiding places. Moving in tactical bounds across the ridgeline, they exposed themselves for the few seconds Balen needed to thin their ranks further. By 3 a.m., Morrison had lost 6 men and accomplished nothing except confirming that their target was far more dangerous than corporate intelligence had suggested. But the mercenary commander still held significant advantages: superior numbers, better equipment, and communication systems that allowed coordinated attacks from multiple directions. As the night wore on, Balen found himself pressed harder, forced to move constantly to avoid being pinned down by converging fire. It was during one of these tactical withdrawals that disaster nearly struck. A mercenary armed with a thermal imaging scope caught sight of Balen moving between positions and opened fire with a fully automatic rifle. Bullets sparked off rocks inches from Balen's head as he dove for cover behind a fallen log. For 30 seconds, concentrated fire from 3 different positions kept him pinned down, while Morrison's remaining men maneuvered to surround his location. The situation was deteriorating rapidly, and Balen realized he might not survive to see his cousin's promised reinforcements. That's when he remembered the flare gun Thomas Murdoch's notes had mentioned, using signal flares to coordinate with friendly forces during his conflicts with mining company gunmen. The flare gun had been part of his grandfather's emergency kit, loaded and ready for over a century. As bullets continued to snap overhead, Balen aimed the flare gun at the sky and pulled the trigger. The brilliant red flare burst high above the mountain peaks, visible for miles in every direction. Its harsh light illuminated the battlefield below, revealing the positions of Morrison's mercenaries while simultaneously announcing to anyone watching that the final confrontation had begun. Within minutes, Balen heard the distant rumble of approaching vehicles, multiple engines racing up the mountain roads from the direction of the reservation. Joseph had kept his promise. The cavalry was coming, but Morrison heard the approaching vehicles too, and his voice on the radio carried desperate urgency. "Speed this up! We need him dead before his friends arrive." The final phase of the battle was about to begin, and everything would be decided in the next few minutes. The corporate cell phone Morrison dropped contained everything: recorded conversations about Thomas Murdoch's murder, financial records showing payments to mercenaries, and detailed plans for eliminating anyone who threatened Apex's illegal mining operation. But first, there was still a battle to finish. The sound of approaching vehicles had galvanized both sides. Morrison's remaining mercenaries pressed their attack with desperate intensity, knowing they had only minutes to complete their mission before reinforcements arrived. Meanwhile, Balen fought with the fury of a man who could finally see justice within reach. The breakthrough came when Spirit appeared from the forest like an avenging spirit made flesh. Balen had thought the horse was safely hidden in her shelter deep in the woods, but she had somehow sensed the climactic moment of the battle and come racing back to help. She burst from the tree line at full gallop, striking the nearest mercenary with her hooves and sending him tumbling down the rocky slope. The sight of a wild horse attacking his men broke something in Morrison's tactical composure. He abandoned his overwatch position and came charging down the slope with his remaining soldiers, determined to end this fight through direct confrontation rather than careful maneuvering. It was exactly the mistake Balen had been hoping for. Morrison and his last 3 mercenaries advanced in a rough line, firing as they moved toward Balen's position behind the fallen log. But their approach took them directly through a killing field Balen had prepared weeks earlier, a narrow draw between 2 rocky outcroppings, where Thomas Murdoch had once trapped claim jumpers over a century. Balen's first shot dropped Morrison's, second in command. His second shot forced the remaining mercenaries to take cover behind inadequate rocks that left them partially exposed. The third shot wounded Morrison himself, spinning the corporate commander around and sending his rifle clattering across the stone. That's when the reservation cavalry arrived. Joseph Crow. Feather led a convoy of pickup trucks filled with Apache warriors, their vehicles racing up the dirt road with headlights blazing and engines roaring. The sight of 20 armed tribal members deploying from their trucks was enough to break the remaining mercenaries' will to fight. 2 of Morrison's men immediately threw down their weapons and raised their hands in surrender. The third tried to run and was tackled by Joseph's teenage son before he made it 10 yards. Morrison himself lay wounded against a boulder, clutching his shoulder and staring at the approaching tribal members with the shocked expression of a man whose carefully laid plans had collapsed into complete failure. But it was what happened next that sealed Apex Mining's fate forever. As Morrison struggled to reach for his dropped cell phone, probably to call for extraction, Spirit trotted over and deliberately stepped on the device. The corporate commander's last link to his superiors was crushed under the hooves of the same horse whose ancestors had witnessed his company's crimes a century earlier. "Seems fitting," Balen said, emerging from his defensive position with the Winchester still in his hands. "Your people killed my great-great-grandfather and tried to steal our land. Now his horse's descendant just ended your operation." Morrison glared up at him through pain-clouded eyes. "You have no idea what you've done. Apex has resources you can't imagine. Lawyers, politicians, judges. We own them all." Balen knelt and retrieved Morrison's cell phone, its screen cracked but memory intact. "Maybe, but you made one crucial mistake." "What's that?" "You recorded everything." Balen held up the damaged phone. "Every conversation about murdering my grandfather, every financial transaction paying your mercenaries, every detail of your illegal mining operation. It's all here." The color drained from Morrison's face as he realized the implications. Joseph approached with several tribal police officers, their badges glinting in the flare's dying light. FBI's about 20 minutes out, he reported. So are the state police and about 6 different news crews who heard about armed conflict on Tribal. And Morrison's corporate conspiracy was about to become very public knowledge, but the final justice came from an unexpected source. As dawn broke over the Montana peaks, painting the mountain slopes in shades of gold and crimson, an elderly Apache woman emerged from one of the trucks and walked slowly toward the wounded corporate commander. Balen recognized her immediately. Mary Crowfeather, Joseph's grandmother, and one of the last people alive who remembered the stories of Samuel Crowfeather's murder. She stood over Morrison for a long moment, her weathered face showing no emotion. Then she spoke in the Apache language, her words carrying the weight of generations. She says, "Your debt is finally paid," Joseph translated. "The spirits of our murdered ancestors can rest now that justice has found their killers." Morrison tried to respond, but the sound of approaching helicopters cut him off. The FBI had arrived, along with news crews whose cameras would broadcast the corporate conspiracy to the entire nation. As federal agents took Morrison and his surviving mercenaries into custody, Balen stood with his tribal family on the land that had cost so much blood to protect. Spirit grazed peacefully nearby, as if the violence of the past few hours had been nothing more than a bad dream. The cell phone evidence would destroy Apex Mining Solutions within months. The company's executives would face federal charges for murder, racketeering, and conspiracy. Their illegal mining operations would be shut down permanently, and the mineral rights would finally return to their rightful owners. But for Balen, the real victory was simpler and more profound. He had kept the promise his grandfather couldn't keep. He had protected the family land and honored the sacrifice of ancestors who had died defending it. As the sun climbed higher over the peaceful Montana mountains, justice had finally come home. The deed of return was signed on a crisp October morning, 6 months after the last shots were fired in defense of Crowfeather land. Balen stood in the tribal council chambers, surrounded by members of his extended family, as the legal documents were formally executed. The mineral rights that had been stolen over a century ago were finally being transferred back to tribal ownership, with Balen designated as the permanent trustee on behalf of all Apache people. The ceremony was simple but profound. Elder Mary Crowfeather, now recognized as the oldest living member of the tribe, placed her weathered hand on the deed as Balen signed his name. Joseph spoke words in the Apache language that honored the ancestors who had died protecting this land, while children who would inherit its benefits watched from the audience. But the real celebration was taking place back at the ranch, where Spirit grazed peacefully in the restored meadow. The old mare had become something of a local celebrity in the months following the battle. News stories about the guardian horse, who had helped expose a corporate conspiracy, had drawn visitors from around the world. But Spirit remained focused on her original mission, protecting the land and the family that belonged to it. Balen had rebuilt the cabin using traditional methods, incorporating both Apache craftsmanship and the practical innovations Thomas Murdoch had developed over his decades of solitary life. The result was a home that honored both sides of his heritage, while serving as a memorial to everyone who had sacrificed to preserve this place. The mineral extraction would begin the following spring, but under carefully controlled conditions that prioritized environmental protection and tribal sovereignty. The estimated revenue of over $50 million would fund education, healthcare, and cultural preservation programs for Apache communities throughout Montana. More importantly, the legal precedent established by the case would help other tribes reclaim lands and resources that had been stolen through corporate fraud and government corruption. Morrison and 12 other Apex executives had been sentenced to life in prison for conspiracy, murder, and racketeering. The company itself had been dissolved, its assets distributed to victims' families and tribal communities that had been targeted by their criminal operations. The corporate cell phone evidence had led to investigations that exposed corruption reaching all the way to the territorial capital. But for Balen, the most meaningful change was simpler and more personal. He had found his place in the world, no longer caught between two cultures, but serving as a bridge that honored both. The ranch had become a gathering place where tribal members came to reconnect with their heritage, while learning from Thomas Murdoch's careful stewardship of the land. Balen had also discovered a new purpose, using the tracking and tactical skills that had served him in Afghanistan and during the fight with Apache. He now worked as a consultant, helping other Native American communities protect their lands from corporate exploitation. Spirit accompanied him on many of these missions, her presence serving as both practical assistance and spiritual reminder of what they were fighting to preserve. On this particular morning, as autumn painted the Montana peaks in shades of gold and crimson, Balen stood on the porch of his rebuilt cabin and reflected on the journey that had brought him here. The inheritance letter that had started it all was now framed on his mantelpiece, alongside the sheriff's badge Thomas Murdoch had worn while defending Apache rights. Both artifacts served as reminders that justice, however long delayed, could still find its way home when people were willing to fight for what was right. Spirit wandered over from her grazing spot and nuzzled his hand, her brown eyes holding the same intelligence and wisdom that had guided him through the darkest moments of his battle with Apache. At 25 years old, she was getting on in years for a horse, but her spirit remained strong and her loyalty absolute. "We did it, girl," Balen said softly, stroking her neck. "We kept the promise." The horse whinnied quietly, a sound that somehow conveyed satisfaction and peace. In the distance, the sound of approaching vehicles announced the arrival of visitors. But these weren't corporate mercenaries or government agents. They were family members coming for the weekly gathering that had become a tradition at the ranch. Joseph's truck led the convoy, followed by vehicles carrying elders, children, and young adults who came to hear stories about their heritage and learn traditional skills that had been nearly lost to time. The ranch had become a cultural center where Apache traditions were preserved and passed to new generations. As the visitors unloaded and began setting up for their gathering, Balen felt the presence of ancestors who had fought so hard to preserve this moment. Thomas Murdoch and Sarah, Samuel Crow Feather and the unnamed deputy who had died beside him. All the warriors and guardians who had sacrificed so that this land and its people could survive. The sound of children's laughter filled the mountain air as the youngest members of the tribe ran through meadows that their great-great-grandparents had protected with their lives. It was the sound Thomas Murdoch had dreamed of hearing during his lonely decades of guardianship, the proof that his sacrifice had not been in vain. As the sun climbed higher over the peaceful ranch, Balen knew that his grandfather's mission was finally complete. The land had been returned to its rightful owners. The family was whole again, and justice, however long delayed, had finally found its way home. Spirit stood beside him on the porch, watching over the gathering with the same protective instinct that had kept her waiting at this place for decades. She was no longer alone in her guardianship. The family had come home, and the land was safe. In the end, that was all any of them had ever wanted, to know that the next generation would inherit something better than what they had received, and that the sacrifices of the past would create hope for the future. The deed of return rustled gently in the mountain breeze, a legal document that represented so much more than mineral rights or property ownership. It was proof that some promises, no matter how long delayed, could still be kept, and in the laughter of children playing on ancestral land, in the wisdom of elders sharing traditional stories, and in the quiet satisfaction of a job well done, Balen found the peace that had eluded his family for over a century. The inheritance was complete. The circle was closed. The land was home.